Okay, welcome everybody. I make it just 5:30, so we will get started. Welcome to the latest in our co-banded today, co-badged Discovering History seminar, and also today part of the Heritage Festival. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're meeting today on the lands of Dja and Taungurung peoples, and to pay my respects to elders past and present. And there may be people on Zoom who are joining us from different places around Australia and perhaps even internationally. And I'd certainly also like to extend my respects to any First Nations people that might be either here in the room with us or watching on Zoom. So this Discovering History seminar series is part of a partnership between La Trobe University, the Goldfields Library and the Bendigo Regional Archive Centre. And my name is Dr. Emma Robertson and I'm a historian at La Trobe University at the Bendigo campus. So it's a great pleasure today to introduce our session, well, I can't quite speak, our session on called A Matter of Judgement, Court Records of the Bendigo Regional Archives and the Bendigo Archives. And we have 3 speakers today, all of whom will have about 15 minutes. I'll probably just introduce them as we go along, but we have 2 people from the Bendigo Regional Archives, Desiree Pettit and Dr. Susan Walter. And also we have Trevor Budge with us today, who'll be our final speaker. So I'll introduce them as we go along. I'd like to start by introducing Desiree. Desiree is the Archives Officer at the Bendigo Regional Archive Centre. She's been the Archive Officer for over 6 years now, with a primary focus on developing outreach programs. And Desiree holds a graduate diploma in Applied and Local History from the University of New England. And she has a particular interest in social and in sporting history. So Desiree, I'll hand over to you for the first part of our presentation today. Thank you.
Is it on?
Might have to turn it on.
There we go. Excellent. Very good. Thank you, Emma. You've stolen a little bit of my talk about the partnership with this event, but that's fine. So we've got another partnership as well, and that is of the Bendigo Regional Archive Centre, which is a grouping formed by the Public Records Office of Victoria, the Goldfields Library Corporation and Bendigo Council. And it's in keeping with one of Prov's aims to keep records as close to their point of origin as possible. We hold government agency records, as the title of Public Records Office suggests, which is things like hospitals and schools and councils and, of course, our courts records. Now, the series that we've got spans 62 series, which, of course, relates to hundreds and hundreds of individual volumes and records. And that's quite tricky to navigate. It covers 8 different court locations and also 8 different court types. So it's a bit tricky to get through. It's a bit convoluted. So we thought we would design this guide that will hopefully help people get through it. Now, the people who are here will find one on their seats. We also have it on our website and a link on our Facebook page as well. It's there as a PDF. For those of you who are here and do have a hard copy, if you're a little bit like me and start to do this with everything, then you can obviously enlarge it from the online version. As I said, it covers 8 different courts. These are the locations. Obviously, there's a lot more courts. It's the same with most of our collections, that there's various issues of records being lost over time or transferred or not transferred. So it's certainly not comprehensive, but it is quite extensive. Now, in the guide, we've got a very brief timeline of the development of different elements of the justice system, and particularly with the focus on Bendigo and our broader catchment area. For those of you who didn't learn Latin at school, we also put together a glossary. I don't know how many times Sue and I would shout to each other from the opposite ends of the reading room saying, "What on earth is a next friend?" or some other term that we hadn't heard before. So we've put a brief glossary together. Again, it's not comprehensive, but these are some of the terms that are used quite repetitively throughout the collections. We've got a listing of records that were thank you, were created in Bendigo, but aren't actually held here in either of our repositories. So there's a listing of what you can find at North Melbourne, which is the Victorian Archive Centre, and also some at Ballarat, and also some that are online. Then we've got record collections that are broad, but do include references to Bendigo cases and Bendigo events, and obviously the broader district. This photo here comes from the criminal registers. Smiling face there belies a rather dark story and a few dark undertones, but again relates to a Bendigo accountant that falls into one of these records. These are the ones that have been largely digitised, so they're easier to access. Obviously, the broader courts collection is massive. What Prov hold at North Melbourne is huge, and obviously there are lots of cross references to the Bendigo district. They've got a brilliant guide online. I think they've still got hard copies down at the reading room that you can access, that covers off all of the various parts of their collection. There's also a terrific search portal that takes you through step by step the various records that you need to access things like criminal trial brief papers. It can be a bit convoluted. There's an index that then will lead you to a register that will then lead you to a file. So this step-by-step that they've developed is really, really, really detailed and really helpful in finding what you're looking for. Again, 8 different court types that feature in our collection, and that's how we've structured our guide. So it is by the different court types that you'll find our different series. And for each one, we explain the function of that court in fairly brief and hopefully easy to understand terms, and where applicable, how they interact with each other as well. There'll be a listing in each section of the records that we have for that particular agency. And then beneath that, we'll have a summary of the series. So what we've put together is the number of volumes that are in that particular series. We've got the dates that they cover. They're not always complete. Sometimes the description on the Prov catalogues might say a certain period, but there will be gaps within that period that we just don't have the records. We've tried to note those where we're aware of them, but again, that's not complete. You'll see some notes there. So there's this particular record. There's only 28 entries in that record. So it's probably more about managing people's expectations, that if you're coming in to look at a volume and you're expecting a full book, that's not going to be the case with this one. If you're like me, you'd probably still have to come in and look at it just in case that thing you're looking for is there. But it's just to help you again understand what's in those particular collections. There's a link at the bottom, which obviously not so useful for the hard copy guides, but online they're hyperlinked. So if you're interested in ordering something from any particular series, you can click that link and it will take you straight to that page in Prov's catalogue and you can order direct from there. So it just hopefully makes it a lot easier to navigate that search system as well. Where a series links to another series, we've tried to make a note of that, even if it is outside of the court series. So this is an example where the petty sessions registers for the receiving ward at the Bendigo Hospital link to the Bendigo Hospital collection, the patient records, for example. So where there's interaction with series, we've tried to include that. You'll also note there for both of those series that we've got index. So if there's nothing there, we're not aware of an index. If it does say index, then there's either one that forms part of the record itself, so it'll be an A to Z at the front of the book, or as is in this case, we've created an index to these records and you can access it on our website. So on the collections page of the BRAC website, there's a whole list of all of the different indexes that we've got that can be accessed from anywhere. They're mostly Excel spreadsheets. Things like the rates records have a full Excel song and dance around them that makes it a big collection a lot easier to use, but these ones are usually quite simple. In terms of the establishment of the courts and the buildings and the politics and the evolution and that sort of thing, that's not in the guide. It really is just a simple series exploration rather than a history as such, but there are lots and lots of resources in the Bendigo Library that touch on all of those different elements. So one of the really important features of all of our archive collection, I think, is the fact that it links into so many other parts of the collection, so many different other agencies and other resources that are around in both the library and the National Archives and the State Archives down in North Melbourne. A few examples of this from our own collection. So this is from the Inward Correspondence collection of the city of Bendigo. So it spans from 1856 through to the turn of the century. There's almost 17,000 individual letters in that collection. It's one of my favourite parts of the collection. Thankfully, it's very, very well indexed, which is fantastic. But it doesn't always give us a lot of context. So this is one example from that collection. It's a subpoena that was sent to the mayor and some councillors in 1872. And that's all it tells us. We've got a plaint number, we've got a date, and we've got some names. It doesn't tell us why they were being summoned to court or what the case was about. So in this case, we can go to the county court series, and this tells us what the county court does and what that register does. And we can go away and we can go, right, that probably connects the two. So we can grab that register out and we can have a look, and we can go to that date, and using that plaint number on the subpoena, we can find the case that we're looking for. In this case, it was for the illegal detention of goods. So someone's maybe not paid for something and the councillors have decided to hang on to it. Another area of interest, if people are looking at the history of different legislation that's been introduced and its impacts, this is the rather gloriously named Motorboating Act of 1861. And if we go to the petty sessions registers for Heathcote, obviously the home of the lovely Lake Eppalock, we find after these various amendments are put in place, the police are having a field day at Lake Eppalock. They are fining people left, right and centre. There are pages and pages and pages of people being fined for not having fire extinguishers, not having life jackets, as we've captured in this sample here. All sorts of things that are going on out there. So very, very busy court sitting days after lovely January weekends. This is another really good example, I think, of obviously the collection's useful for genealogists and people researching individuals, but for social historians as well. Once you look through these sets, you're finding patterns and you're finding trends and you're seeing all of these different things that relate to broader history. So they're a really, really useful collection. This one here is an example of that step by step that I was talking about earlier. We've got register indexes here for the Bendigo Supreme Court. Yes, we do. So we've got an entry here for a John Allen. From there, we can find the entry in the criminal trial brief registers, which are kept at North Melbourne. We can find some details about that case there. And from there, we can then order the actual brief papers. And so we get the depositions, we get the details, we get the judgments from that case, and a really lovely trail of records. I highly recommend just getting out records and flicking through them, because you will find the most fascinating and mad things that are happening within them. Occasionally you'll find a case that is a bit curious. This was one of them. Notice there that we've got co-defendants up the top. We've got Annie and George Webb, which is a bit interesting on its own. And then the conviction result was also a bit interesting. So we went away and had a look at this. And as you can see there on the right, it describes the charge. It says feloniously stealing, taking and carrying away 3 jars of lollies, 2 dozen oranges of the value of 7 shillings, the property of Catherine Musgrove at Bendigo in 1902. So we went away and we looked up this story, and we found that what actually happened was this was related to a confectionery shop in Bridge Street. And the next door neighbours were George and Annie, very heavily pregnant, 2 in the morning, decided that she had very, very strong sugar cravings. And the only way she could satiate them, because we didn't have all-night servos in 1902, was to take a brick from her garden and smash the window and take some lollies and some oranges. So we get the whole story from this, from various transcripts of what was going on in court. And the convicted and discharged conditionally, again, I found quite interesting. We go away and we look at what the judge actually said when he handed down that penalty. When a woman is in a certain condition, there's an impulse for certain things, and that impulse cannot be resisted. Any medical authority knows that. So a little bit of precedence there if we've got any expectant mothers joining us tonight. So if you do find wonderful stories like that when you're going through any of our collections, but particularly the Courts collection, please let us know. We love sharing with people what they can find in our collections, as do Prov. So you can always contact their team as well and share any wonderful little stories that you've found a rabbit hole for in your research. I will now hand over to my colleague, Dr. Sue Walter, who will expand on some of those ideas around linkage and broader topics.
Desiree. That's fascinating. Instead, we're going to hand over to Susan. I should give Susan a bit of an intro. Susan has been the BRAC Archives Coordinator for almost 4 years and has over 20 years of experience volunteering for a community history collection with a focus on history research and collection management. Originally working as an agricultural scientist, Susan completed a PhD in Australian history in 2019 on Malmesbury Bluestone, and confesses to having an obsession with finding, using and researching land records and researching building stone. And some of you may have heard Susan's fascinating talks on Bluestone here before. Over to you, Susan.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, okay. Good. Okay. Thank you, Emma and Desiree. Delivering this new guide to the public has been a massive piece of work by Desiree over many, many months, and has also required detailed examination of a large range of records identified in our collection. The relative visual simplicity of this guide masks the efforts also made in interpreting seemingly illegible handwriting and learning unfamiliar terminology to produce what we hope will be a valuable guide for researchers. Once plans for this guide were underway, the event promoted and Desiree's massive task of creating the guide neared completion, the big question for me was how to introduce this guide to the public and demonstrate its value. An inspiration came from an unlikely source: local traffic. Okay. It's pretty easy to walk through the Bendigo CBD and watch cars fail to give way to pedestrians, especially when turning into a street. I have been known to voice my protest, which often results in receiving a finger or occasionally verbal abuse, supposedly because they assume they are in the right, or they just don't care. The actual traffic rule for drivers in this circumstance is, if the driver is turning left or right, or making a U-turn, the driver must also give way to any pedestrian at or near the intersection who is crossing the road or part of the road the driver is entering. But it made me think, if we insist a driver has a learner's permit and a licence as part of the legislated process of ensuring they know the road laws before they drive solo, how do we as a community know what all the other laws are, local, state and federal, that we are expected to abide by? And who checks that our knowledge is current? Of course, running in parallel to this courts guide is our equally wonderful website, Trove Digital Newspapers. And while many court cases are recorded in detail in local newspapers, tonight I'll also show you why relying on Trove alone won't give you a complete picture. For example, Bylaw number 6, issued by Bendigo Council in 1877, which in our collection states, no person shall engage in any sports or game in Rosalind Park, or commit any nuisance therein, or leave any orange peel. I have an inquiring mind, so I'd like to know if and when that was repealed. Otherwise, I also have to know, is geocaching classed as a game, therefore banned? What happens if bagpipes on Scott's Day Out are a nuisance to some? And could mandarin or apple peel be left in the park now if it is now defined by our council as FOGO? In this case of fraudulent games in 1871, John Coleman and Aaron Jones thought they had done the right thing by getting what they thought was permission. And while they were not fined, they were forced to make a donation to the poor box. So pleading ignorance of laws is allowed for, but sometimes there is still a penalty. But if this did take place in Rosalind Park, is that one of the reasons Bylaw 6 was written in the first place in 1877? Do we learn our laws through community, trial and error, word of mouth, or direct communication by the creators and enforcers of laws? I would argue that all of these apply, though it may not be until we get into trouble, rely on misinformation, or openly defy the law that we find out what the consequences are. If the laws are written in a language other than what we naturally speak, can we plead ignorance? Erecting warning signs, as suggested there, only works if people can read. If you can't read, as in the case of Arsoon, who was fined for digging in the Bendigo Creek in 1874, whose responsibility is it to ensure a verbal warning is given? And how long do you wait for word of mouth to work before you start prosecuting non-compliance? Most of our parents and community leaders tell us not to lie, steal, or abuse others, and to be fair to everyone. Or, in other words, follow the basic community rule of do as you would be done by, in order to fit into society and lead a quiet and productive life. Many remind us that there are consequences for not doing so. Most of us obey or get the occasional fine as a reminder, for example, a parking fine when we lapse. There again, we are flawed creatures, and when it comes to laws, some are hypocrites and do the opposite of what they say. This can include parents, teachers, work colleagues, politicians, and drivers. If we add poverty or poor literacy into the mix, our task of getting the message through on laws becomes more difficult. There is no manual to life issued to each person at birth, and for some, learning by printed word will be a lifelong problem. Modern learning and workplaces are still struggling to understand that not everyone learns well by reading large quantities of text or by attending workshops or online seminars with an overly verbose presenter in a warm room who drones on, or who doesn't control chatting participants, with no written material offered or chance to discuss the material afterwards. Truancy was illegal and supposedly still is, but recent trends in school refusal are highlighting problems with the very education system children are required to participate in. Education has to be an ongoing and two-way process. And even if we know the law, what happens when the power to obey them is taken from us? If someone was deemed a vagrant and unable to support themselves financially, did putting them in jail solve that? Did that prevent the children, perhaps belonging to people like John Jenkins here, then being deemed neglected and sent to an industrial school? If a lack of food and no means by which to procure some forces theft, who really is in the wrong? But a study of court records might give us some answers. In this example, if you were searching for John Jenkins on Trove, you would be unlikely to find this article due to the OCR errors, but it can be found by looking for specific crimes like vagrancy or using VPRS 16736. And by the way, the anonymous drunkard was Andrew Thomas. Anonymous, of course, until you actually look at the court registers. Yes, it used to be referred to as unpaid work and labour and deemed a civil case. But now, despite it being a federal crime, why is wage theft still happening today? What if John Jenkins, a vagrant, had been a victim of this uncivil matter? Can these court records demonstrate that wage theft leads to the downward spiral towards poverty, non-payment of rates and vagrancy? Perhaps that is a project for a keen historian. And speaking of non-payment of rates, some of you may well be aware that most of the Huntly Shire rate books no longer exist. But a small fraction of Huntly ratepayers are recorded in the court records because they didn't pay their rates. Many are reported in local media, but in the cases shown here from 1871, they won't ever be found on Trove because that issue of the newspaper is not even available. And how many cases such as this one between Susan Cox and Matthew Wall for neglecting to maintain an illegitimate child are slowly being solved one way or another by family history detectives and DNA tests? I'll put my bets on DNA over diminishing someone's character in public any day. But can we demonstrate how often the mother was correct by using DNA and court records? It's a pity they didn't have DNA tests back then. Thankfully, for many who currently face life difficulties, such as being a single parent, we now have social security, which theoretically avoids theft of food. But the growing trend of unaffordable housing has coincided with some local councils banning the homeless from sleeping in public. Non-compliance is not always an option. And we can see how the creation of court records is an ongoing process when we don't remove barriers to obeying laws. And if we are using Trove to find information, we must also be aware that while there may only be one court report in the papers, the cases may be in different registers. In this example, Arsoon's previously mentioned digging in the Bendigo Creek is recorded in VPRS 16736 or the criminal cause books, because that was a criminal case, while the 6 anonymous defaulting ratepayers were a civil case, so they appear in VPRS 16735 or civil cases. And of course, the register does record the names of those rate defaulters, as you can see on the slide there, even though the newspaper didn't want to record them. It is also possible to find examples of court cases which were not reported in the papers at all. In 1872, this court report mentions 3 anonymous drunks who the court records actually show were Michael Anderson, Thomas Jamieson and John Lord, and a case of theft by John Thompson and Edward Flynn. There is, however, no mention of the case of Jonathan Carter, who was charged with being away from his horse and wagonette so as to enable to have the full control of them. Why he missed out on being reported in the paper is obviously the reporters, up to the reporter to talk about, not me, because I don't know. But what was the long-term fate of those deemed drunkards? And would they also show up as victims of wage theft in cases of vagrancy? Court records could reveal such patterns. And even if a case was reported, can we find it if we don't know it exists? In this case, we have 2 different spellings of the same surname in the papers, Lauder and Louder, the first being the version in the court records, both of which we could probably find if we think phonetically with our searches. But would we think to search for Lauderweicher, which is what the OCR text for the first article currently reports? Here we have to be smarter than current AI and use the human eye and brain to recognise patterns in misread digitised text created from old microfilm newspapers, and realise that lowercase e is frequently misread as C, Y is frequently misread as V, lowercase a and e as O, and capital R as H. So with respect to a history of our local law and order, access to information is only part of what is going on. If the internet, digital books and AI are the be-all and end-all for information, then drivers in the CBD would always give way to pedestrians. How and when we seek information, the quality of that information, what we do with it, our capacity to realise what is missing, and our understanding of the consequences of information are just as important. Is there a sense of arrogance in some drivers that their knowledge of road laws is complete and therefore looking for information was unnecessary? Do they consider ignorance a defence for bad behaviour? Do they even care? Is maintaining order in society irrelevant to them? Do their mates on Facebook, who also don't look for information, tell them they have done nothing wrong? Are they happily ignorant of consequences? Until there are some. The court records outlined in the new guide not only document those who have transgressed or been wrongfully accused of transgressing, but they also reflect society's assumptions that we know the laws in the first place and wish to and can take action or inaction appropriately. Yes, the details of various court cases in these records can probably be found online via Trove newspapers, but many can't because of OCR errors, a clear example of inadequate or incomplete information. This might not be of any major consequence if it is an individual case we are seeking to include in a family history, local history, or the history of a home. But if we seek to understand a community as a whole, their understanding of and interaction with the law, and how a community judges people, then these records offer a window unlike any other. Were family members alone in their transgressions, and what led them to do so? What else is happening at the time that influenced their decisions? These records as a whole could give us those patterns. And if you also want an idea of just how much law we theoretically have to know, or to help you interpret judgments, you want to know more information on what laws there were, this is a really great website that offers a feast of past legislation both in Victoria and interstate. And all I can say is happy reading, because there's a huge number of them. So we invite you, the audience, to take advantage of these records, to understand the history of your families, communities and places. And we hope this guide will open those windows for you and allow you to see and understand our past. Which in closing reminds me of some words by Henry Lawson from his poem Faces in the Street. I wonder would the apathy of wealthy men endure were all their windows level with the faces of the poor? And maybe a question for another day is, instead of focusing on orange peel, why has greed never been made a crime? Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for that, Susan. That was fascinating. I'd now like to introduce our final speaker, which is Trevor Budge, AM, I should probably say, Trevor. Trevor is the World Heritage Strategic Projects Officer at the City of Greater Bendigo, working with the Heritage Victoria project team on preparing a nomination for the World Heritage Committee. Trevor is a former manager at the City of Bendigo Council of Strategy and Regional Sustainable Development. He is a former colleague of mine, and associate professor in the Community Planning and Development Programme at La Trobe University. He was a town planning consultant for 16 years and worked for state, regional and local government bodies. And Trevor was also a local Bendigo resident living in Quarry Hill from 1977 to 2021. So it's a great pleasure to have you back here in Bendigo, Trevor. I'm going to hand over to you for our final session of this talk.
Thanks very much, Emma. There's a lot more information about this than I'll be able to present tonight, but if you go to that website, you'll see a stack of information there that you can access. So I too would like to recognise the traditional owners upon which the World Heritage Bid is located. We're actually working with a large number of registered Aboriginal parties, and in some cases, some areas where there are no registered Aboriginal parties. So I pay my respects to those traditional owners and recognise that the land has never been ceded. So if you don't know about World Heritage, it's been around for 50 years. It was conceived to really recognise those places in the world that we want to keep. In Australia, we have 20 places on the World Heritage Register. Most of them are natural sites, and you'll know many of them: Uluru, Sydney Harbour Bridge, Great Barrier Reef, etc. There are 2 in Victoria: the State Exhibition Building and Carlton Gardens, and then also Budge Bim down in the southwest site, which is an Indigenous location where the eel traps are located. We're looking at, in the case of the Victorian Goldfields, a similar project to what was done with the Australian convict sites, and that's a number of sites. So it's called a serial listing, where one single site cannot tell you the whole story. You have to take the totality of what you're looking at. So we have 15 local government partners. We have 2 patrons, very politically. We got John Brumby and Dennis Napthine, former premiers, to be patrons. They've been incredibly influential behind the scene. And of course, we work with state government. State government backed this project a couple of years ago. And so it's now got a substantial momentum behind it. The geographical areas that we are involved with, those 15 councils, of course, do not cover the entire Goldfields area. It'll be more than half Victoria if we put everyone in, but these are the areas which had the most substantial heritage, which will contribute to the World Heritage recognition if we can get it. Now, one of the things you have to prove is, why are the Victorian goldfields unique in the world? There were many goldfields in the period that we're talking about, 1850 to 1900. If you'd know California, very high profile, Otago in New Zealand, Siberia, very substantial goldfields in Siberia, in South America, at the very end of the century in South Africa, other parts of Australia right through that 19th century period, and then of course places like Klondike and Alaska. So I'll talk about why we believe the Victorian goldfields are the best representative example, and also want to talk a little bit about what this, we hope, will do for the regions, what will achieving World Heritage achieve for the regions. So this has been a project that's been going for about 35 years. In 1989, John Brumby and late Professor Weston Bate at Malden announced that they were going to make a bid for World Heritage listing. It's bumped along a lot since that announcement, including a project in 2008, 2009 to put forward the Castlemaine diggings, as a World Heritage Site. The advice from the Australian government was that that was insufficient to tell the story. It doesn't tell the full story. And in many ways, it was a blessing because it forced us to think differently about how we'd go about this. And I'll come back to that in a second. And this idea of using World Heritage as a regeneration project in the region. And this is actually something consistent with what UNESCO say. This is an opportunity for regions that perhaps have missed the boat in many respects in terms of some of the development we see around the world. How can we use World Heritage in a positive way? So in terms of government support, the Victorian government allocated about $2.5 million to this project over the last few years, including an allocation of $2 million almost exactly 2 years ago. And that was a commitment to see World Heritage listings of Victorian goldfields go right through the process to a submission to the World Heritage Committee. And I'll talk about that in a minute. What we have done is taken the project to the point of what's called tentative listing. You might have heard of tentative listing. Back in late January this year, we achieved tentative listing. Tentative listing is a requirement of the Australian government. It's a requirement of UNESCO. Any property has to be on the tentative list for at least 1 year before you can nominate it, do a full nomination dossier and management plan to the World Heritage Committee. So we are working now to a deadline of having this ready by early next year. So in terms of our timelines, we can go right back, as I said, to 1989, but it's really taken off in the last 5 or 6 years where those 15 councils came together with an MOU to say we're going to work together. And then, of course, persuading the state government to back it. We use a variety of people, and as you said, there's a project team. One of the important people in that project team is a guy called Barry Gamble, who lives in Cornwall. Ironically, during the project, and we're talking here about records and family histories and so on, Barry and I started talking about our family histories and we realised that we were related. His great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather and my great-great-grandfather were born in the same town. Extraordinary, isn't it? And so what Barry's done is he's done a comparative analysis of over 40 gold mining settlements and rushes around the world. And he's come to the conclusion that we've got the best surviving example of it. Doesn't mean that we were necessarily the biggest. We were very much comparable with California in terms of scale, but a lot of what they had hasn't survived. And what Barry has done is he's now authored 21 successful nominations to the World Heritage Committee. He hasn't had a failure yet. He says he only backs winners, and that's why he says he's backing us. So we'll see. So what you have to demonstrate to achieve World Heritage ranking is what's called outstanding universal value. What makes the Victorian goldfields stand out from the others, from the other competitors? And what we're saying is that, and these are words taken straight out of Barry's tentative list nomination. Why are we a standout? What have we got that others haven't got? And I'll use a couple of examples and I'll draw upon some of the material you've already heard. Most of the places around the world that had gold rushes did not have law and order. They were quite lawless. And in fact, that's one of the distinguishing features of the Australian goldfields, and particularly the Victorian goldfields. All those courthouses are contributory to that. The fact that we had lockups, we had police, we had jails and so on, that's a distinguishing feature, generally of the British Empire gold rushes. Another feature is that we are in a low rainfall area. Just about all the other goldfields in the world were in high rainfall areas or snow melt areas, which has destroyed any wooden buildings and has often washed away what was there. And because they were high rainfall areas, they used what's called hydraulic sluicing, which simply blasted the gold out of the creeks and rivers. And so any of the remnants that remain, or if they remain at all, they're very scattered and very minor. So largely, if you talk about their heritage, you're talking about memory rather than something that you can show people. Our low rainfall areas, surprisingly, and they're a bonus because we can even go to the alluvial areas and see the original holes where miners undertook that first stage of mining. A very important part of the World Heritage listing is the story of First People. In the last few years, UNESCO has required this to be part of your story. Importantly, and if you think about this, much of the volcanic activity that happened in between Ballarat and Bendigo was actually happening while our first people were on country. Some of those volcanoes, and those volcanoes buried much of the gold in what became known as the deep lead mining areas. So particularly that area north of Creswick, if you know it, that deep lead area, you have to go down through the old volcanic layers and you find the original creek, and there's the gold lying in the creek. This is, from what we can gather, is the only example in the world where the first people actually saw some of the creation of, in a sense, a geological sense, of the goldfields. Some of the other elements that stand out in terms of outstanding universal value. Gold rushes were an amazing event. In Victoria alone, it appears that in the 1850s, about 620,000 people came to Victoria. Now, that's not the final numbers because quite a few people actually went home. But so the population didn't increase by 600,000, but about 600,000 people came. That's an extraordinary movement of people for that time. And when we talk about now, worrying about, population boom and so on, this was on the back of, in 1851, the population of Victoria was 77,000 people, and 600,000 people came in the next 10 years. We had this rushes. So by 1861, there are 278 locations across the goldfields where they've identified a separate locality where there's a gold rush. So we've gone from nothing in 1851 to 278 sites 10 years later. And those rushes were, 1,000 people moved from here to there, and then 2 weeks later, they moved from there to somewhere else. People are arriving from all over the world, but predominantly the British Isles, but also Europe, America, and of course, large contingent of Chinese people come. The last point's very interesting, and that's the number of women and children on the goldfields. Generally, most goldfields around the world are male dominated. In Victoria's case, even at that date I mentioned, 1861, with 278 locations where there was gold mining happening, there were only 2 where there were no women. So women were accompanying men, mostly married women, accompanying their husbands onto the goldfields, and generally around 30% of the population on each of the goldfields with women, and also large numbers of children. That is in contrast to most other goldfields around the world. In order to get World Heritage listing, you have to meet 1 of 10 criteria. We're putting this forward as meeting 2. Essentially, that's the type of architecture that we've got, which represents the gold rush period, but also the idea of that this is directly and tangibly associated with living traditions, with artistic, literary work, things of outstanding significance. These happened during that goldfields period. So I mentioned about a serial listing approach. This is the approach that was used in Cornwall, West Devon. And there they had a series of sites which obviously recount the copper and tin mining history of Cornwall, West Devon. So you could have put a blanket over almost the entire area, but what they did was to pick a number of sites which are representative of what happened during that period. So some represent the mining areas, some represent the industrial areas, some represent the ports and so on. So you get this concept of a serial listing. Collectively, in total, they tell the story. And that's what we're trying to do. So going back to tentative listing, if you want to go to that website, it's interesting to read because that's the submission that was put forward to the Australian government. And tentative listing means the Australian government has prima facie accepted that we have something worthwhile putting forward. Doesn't say they are going to put it forward, but it's already, that goes onto the World Heritage site as tentative listing. Now, some of those properties on the Australian World Heritage tentative list have been there for a long time because they're trying to put their case together. We've been given a time slot, which is get it ready for early next year. And if it meets the Australian government's criteria, it will go forward. Importantly, tentative listing doesn't actually carry with it any legal implications. World Heritage listing does. Now, these are the locations that have been identified. What you do in a tentative listing is you identify simply a coordinate. In the case of Bendigo, the coordinate is sitting on the Bendigo, the former Bendigo post office. That means that that's a location, and there are other sites in Bendigo that are under consideration. What we ended up was 6 sites that actually met all the criteria that the Australian government wanted. 3 sites have been identified there in the light green. They're sites that haven't met all the criteria yet, but we're working on achieving those full 9 sites. In fact, what will happen is probably we'll end up with about 13 or 14 sites. You can add sites during this tentative list process. So what are they? It's a very distinctive set of rural and urban landscapes. You'll know from driving around the region that, you know, you can just turn a corner and all of a sudden there's a mullock heap in the middle of a paddock. And, you know, what does that mean? What happened? So what we're talking about is a transformation of an entire landscape. And we've really only got remnants of what was there. And ironically, of course, it's in places like Bendigo and Ballarat that the greatest transformations in the landscape have taken place, because in the 1950s and 60s, people were complaining about these dusty sites that were eyesores on the landscape, and a lot of them were cleared, and in some cases, you know, been covered with housing. So we're looking at various attributes. When you put forward a World Heritage nomination, you have to say, what are the attributes? So here's some of the attributes. It is, obviously with gold, it's about the geology of the area. And of course, much of the gold sits within that box ironbark forest, which is a unique natural asset that we have here in North Central Victoria. We're on traditional country. Obviously, a whole lot of diverse cultures come and leave their mark. We have different mining landscapes. There's one down here in the Castlemaine Diggings area. Even our smallest settlements, and this is a classic example here, you know, a chimney at the back of the bank, which was used for smelting gold. And what we can gather, there are none left in the world except the ones that we've got in the Central Victorian area here. And then, of course, there's all sorts of different technologies that were used. So now here's some, I've given you here some comparative examples of a lot of things across the Victorian goldfields, but also some examples from overseas. You can see in examples of sluicing there on the left-hand side. Can't remember where that's come from. Oh, that's a Californian one. And, you know, it's simply blasted the creek out, and that's how they got the gold. Whereas we had these holes, which are still there. That's, you know, a defining element that we've got. We had in Victoria the 6 major types of gold mining. You know, deep lead I've mentioned, alluvial I've mentioned. We've got quartz, which is very much the Bendigo example. We've got open cut, which is the classic example we have is Balaclava Hill at Roo, just south of Rushworth. We had hydraulic sluicing. Yes, we had it, but nothing of the scale of what we're talking about in the other goldfields. And then, of course, when you get to something like Walhalla, you're talking about horizontal hard rock tunnelling, which is a fairly rare example in terms of mining. So we're competing against other places around the globe. And the series of slides I've got draw upon some of our examples, but also draw upon examples from around the world. Here's our open cut example. So the one on the bottom right is a fascinating one. This is a gold mine in Japan from the 17th century. One of the examples of an open cut mine. But of course, lower left is the example of Roo. When I showed Barry Gamble that site, he was, as a geologist, I thought he was going to, you know, kiss the ground. He was so in love with it. He couldn't believe it that we had an example like that. He says it's one of the 3 or 4 best examples in the world of an open cut gold mine that's still in basically original condition, hasn't been modified. So we knew that we had a problem with, yep, it's working, yep. One of the things that we have in Victoria, which is really so important, and I've mentioned about our scarcity of water, but it's how we manage that water. And so something we hadn't realised until Barry really took a great detailed look at it was the importance of the Coliban water system. This is one, Barry ranks it as one of the 3 great water systems in the world associated with mining. The other 2 are in Germany. And Coliban Water is very excited about the fact that a lot of that engineering technology, it seems to predate other technology that capitalises on that later. So what we found is that much of the Sydney water system is based on the same technology as was used in Coliban, but about 10 years later. We know that when we've got a lot of photos, it takes a while. Okay, let's see if we can get that back. Yeah. There we go. And of course, we've got these grand buildings, and I mean, you know, the Bendigo Town Hall is a standout. Now, when I said before that our tentative list site is centred on the Bendigo Post Office, what we need to do is link up the sites together. And I don't think it's any secret to suggest that the Bendigo Town Hall will be one of those sites that's linked in. But there's a lot of other considerations. One of the examples is, and a reference in the earlier talk to Rosalind Park, Lower Rosalind Park particularly is a fine example of what early pioneers did. They sought to recreate what they come from. Some of the buildings are much more humble. The examples at Beechworth are absolutely outstanding. If you've been to Beechworth, you've seen that main street, but you've also seen the government precinct. Having a Chinese protectorate office is absolutely unique, as is the Chinese section of the Bendigo Whitehill Cemetery with the Joss House nearby. I mentioned police. Our own police barracks, of course, are significant in that, but as are other remains of buildings. And you can see, I think somehow the A's dropped off California there, but you know, jails and ways of treating people were pretty crude in those days. Our courthouses, I've mentioned, the whole issue of schools. The one on the top right-hand side is fascinating. It's the Masonic Lodge in Walhalla, inside, virtually in original condition. If you can get into there, it's extraordinary to see inside that. And then, of course, we have the humble as well. We have the burnt out, such as the church there at Tarnagulla on the lower right. And these alluvial holes are scattered everywhere. There's a wonderful example at a place called Armstrong's just outside of Ararat, if you're looking for one, because right in the middle of it is a birthing tree. It's extraordinary. It's survived. That birthing tree has survived in it. And of course, we go to the amazing engine houses that are associated with that Creswick deep lead. Which you know, you tend to think, oh, well, that was at the same time as the rest of the gold. No, it wasn't. They really didn't discover those until the 1870s. And then you have a little town like Allendale, which it's not a great town there anymore, but I love it because my grandmother grew up there, and it's the only town we can find that was actually constructed as a private subdivision in the whole history of the goldfields. It was done by an early developer seeking to capitalise. Okay, and then of course we have what's happening with the quartz roasting kilns around Maldon, particularly predominant, and also there's some great ones around Beechworth. And then lower right we have the gunpowder magazine at Beechworth. Barry Gamble says the finest example of a gunpowder magazine on a goldfield anywhere in the world. So repeatedly, when Barry has looked across this and he's drawing upon his knowledge across the world, he's able to say, that's the best example I've ever seen. That's in the 3 best examples I've ever seen. And that's the sort of thing, that story is what's making the goldfield special and increasing our chances of achieving World Heritage listing. And of course, we have these wonderful sites where, whether it's Eureka, whether it's the Monster Meeting, Red Ribbon Rebellion and so on, and that story. And if you go through the history of each of the goldfields town, every one of them had protest meetings. It wasn't just the 3 prominent ones that we're probably most aware of. I think we're just about, yeah, and then some of the examples that I've already referred to. And we'll move on. How are we going for time? 5 minutes more? Okay. Pink Cliffs at Heathcote. Probably the most famous example we've got of hydraulic sluicing. unfortunately, it looks like it won't make the grade because our examples of hydraulic sluicing do not compare with what happened in Otago, what happened in California, what happened in Alaska. So it's as interesting as that place is, it's probably not of World Heritage significance. So what are the features of our story? I've mentioned some of them. Dispossessed traditional owners. A lot of the massacres happened really in that pastoral settlement. What we know that in the goldfields time, gold rush's time, miners performed all sorts of functions. In many cases, they rescued miners who were lost. They actually showed them where gold was. They knew where it was, just didn't put a value on it. In many cases, they became miners themselves. And the documentation that's been done clearly demonstrates that even at Eureka Stockade, there were Aboriginal miners. We can represent the major types of gold mining. That law and order is a really important comment, and also the numbers of women and children, which is a standout from the rest of the world. So finish up, what a benefit is this to the region? Well, this idea that it creates a regional regeneration. If you look at the tourism that happens now associated with our heritage, about 90% of it is Ballarat, Bendigo, places like Dalesford do well and so on. But there's so many places that are just not on people's radar. And I'll use an example like St Arnaud, which I think has got one of the great main streets in the goldfields. And yet I would suggest to you that the vast majority of Victorians never been there, have no concept. So what we were sought to do was how could we use tourism in a sustainable way? How could we use it to regenerate areas that perhaps are not regularly visited and put some income into those? And of course, the only way you really get income is you get overnight stays. Day trips don't really do it. So what we've come up with is as a model, and we know that we're way ahead of many other places that put forward World Heritage nominations in having this sustainable tourism development plan. So what we've said is we need to develop what we've called a concept, World Heritage Journeys. World Heritage Journeys is a UNESCO initiative in association with National Geographic magazine. They've really pushed it very hard in Scotland. If you want to Google that, you'll see what they're doing. We're trying to link up a whole lot of sites. So we're saying what we need to do is establish World Heritage Journeys so that you go from one place to another. And of course, it's not just about going from one World Heritage site to another. It's about you drive past. We've looked at about 2,500 sites. Only a handful are going to get recognised. So there are thousands of sites, literally, that people can go. And there are lots of other tourist attractions. We have to improve the amenity of these places. The rough information is that you can probably expect in the initial years of World Heritage listing a doubling of tourism numbers. We want to create signature experiences. We have to improve the quality of our facilities, and we have to recognise that we'll become an increasingly international destination. So if you go into that website I talked about, you can get the detail of this plan, too detailed to talk through with that. It's going backwards now. Right. There's a whole series of maps about how we can link up these places together. We've got 23 visitor information centres across the goldfields. How are people going to access information? How are they going to access information in the future? Presumably a lot is going to be digital. How can we tap into that interest and demand? We've done some evaluation of what this is likely to be, what the impact is likely to be. Economically, it's been assessed independently, probably put an additional $1 billion into the economy over the next 10 years, which is significant. It's jumping around this. Okay. Finishing off, one of the most important things that from the perspective of tonight that has to go into your nomination is you have to have an education and research strategy associated with it. What we've heard tonight is an example of some incredible material that's around in the region. If you think about the whole region we're looking at. The other day I was at Dalesford and looking at their collection in the Dalesford Museum. Extraordinary what they've managed to, a small town has put together. So this idea where we're linking up with a number of educational institutions, not only in Victoria and Australia, but around the world, who have this interest in colonial heritage associated with the 19th century. This provides us with an opportunity, and hopefully it will stimulate further information and income for those people who are looking at research. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Trevor. Now I know you do have to dash for a train, but do you have time for a couple of questions? If anyone's got questions, particularly for Trevor, who will dash off shortly, and then we can do some more for the archives team as well. Does anyone in the room have any questions about the World Heritage bid? Geordie? Yeah.
So why were there so many more women and children in the Victorian goldfields? Was it the proximity of Melbourne?
Yeah,
or
look, fairly speculative, but that's certainly one of them. Most of the other goldfields were fairly remote. They were pretty tough terrain. We in 1851 were 77,000 people in Victoria. About 40% were females. So we started with a high proportion of females, much higher than most other places started with, particularly say California, which is our comparable area. And so that initiated it. I think the fact that we did have law and order, it was a safer, from the point of view of perhaps, for families, yeah. And the other thing was that, interestingly, if you say compare us with California, how did you get to California? Well, you had to go overland, which was a fairly daunting task, or you sailed around Cape Horn, or you went across the Panama, you sailed to Panama, there's a pre-Panama Canal, and then got back on a ship and then sailed up to San Francisco. So it does appear that we had perhaps a more orderly process. Yeah, so that's some of the explanations we're coming up with.
What about assisted migration?
Yeah, there's no doubt, Charles, that we did have a program of assisted migration which predated the gold rushes. But of course, once the gold rushes took over, it was just, even though there was still assisted migration, the reality is that it was swamped by, and we undercount because we didn't have very good records of exactly who was landing. We had Chinese travelling overland, not only from South Australia, but from New South Wales. We had people coming and leaving who were not documented from the other colonies. But yes, you're right. Assisted migration was an important element in setting up the population base. Yeah.
Has Bendigo done that sort of made it a landscape that's going to be included? You still haven't worked out what's wrong with, or why does it Ballarat?
I'm not in a position, I can't, because it needs to confidentiality, I can't say what the reason is at the moment. Well, that's right. Yes, we know that it's colder. But the Australian government required certain things to be ticked off in the process, and we weren't able to tick them off in the case of Ballarat, Beechworth, and Roo. But they're technicalities really, which we pretty close to resolving, but it doesn't matter. The tentative listing and what's in your tentative list and what's in the final list can be quite different. Yeah.
Were there any questions online, Geordie? Nothing coming up? No, nothing in the chat. Any more questions for Trevor before he leaves us? Well, hopefully we'll be hearing more from you.
Well, hopefully.
Hopefully. I think, are you speaking at the, so I will just, before we take some more questions for the archives, I'll give this a plug. This is the,
speaking of that.
I've got these I can hand out to people in the room, but there is part of the Heritage Festival is an event called the Alchemy of Gold, which is happening in Castlemaine from the 16th to the 18th of May on the golden transformation of Victoria. You probably can't really see this online, but maybe in the room. So there's details about that event here. There's a range of speakers, historians. Yeah, that's when I think Charles is speaking. Charles Fay, who's in the audience here. Trevor, a range of historians. Yeah, coming off the interchange bench. So I do encourage you to have a look at that if people are local, and we can hand those out. But yeah, Trevor, if you do need to dash, feel free. Is there any questions for our archivists? We had a fantastic start to the session where we had Desiree and Susan talking about these court records. I don't know if we've got any family historians in the audience, people that might be looking to use those archives, or indeed anyone online.
I have another question
Ah.
for Desiree. Look, I don't know whether this is true, but I've seen recently that in the early 20th century, there were some criminals who had the option to choose how their mug shots were taken and choose what they wore in them. Now, this is something I've only heard of in the last couple of weeks, and I wonder whether you had heard about it at all.
Outfits. I'm not sure when that came about. I know it's certainly the case in Sydney or New South Wales. I'm not sure about Victoria. You're putting me on the spot. There is a wonderful, well, again, it's a fantastic resource, the criminal registers, particularly I think the female criminal registers, because of all of those mugshots, and you're getting that brilliant, again, social history from just the photographs of what they're wearing and what jobs they're doing and what religion they are, again, picking up patterns in all of those things. Some of the outfits, particularly once you get to the 20s for the women, are incredible. There's one we've actually got on a postcard upstairs, and all I'll say is she looks very Castlemaine. even for the 20s, she would fit in absolutely perfectly in her hometown today.
So you can see those images as part of the collection. Get to those.
They're digitised on.
They're digitised. Amazing. Yeah, those kind of photograph collections are fantastic. Any other? I probably have like a nerd question of my own, but does anyone else have any questions before I get to my nerdy question? No, take it away. Traffic. So it was sort of Susan reminded me with the traffic laws. I've been interested in legislation around women driving and women driving public transport, particularly motor buses. And there's legislation in, I think in South Australia in the 1920s about women not driving and not driving motor buses and not having private motor buses. Have you seen anything in the interwar period about motor bus legislation, or shall I just have to get in and start researching for myself in these records? Nothing yet. All right, I'll just have to get in there. It's fine.
The first truck driven onto the Lake Epilogue site when they were constructing it was driven by a woman, but that's probably the only.
Oh, what year was that?
61, 62. Someone will jump in and correct
Yep,
me very quickly, but yeah.
Thanks, Desiree. It's great. There, yeah, as you know your collection so well, so I'm not hopeful if you haven't found it, but well, thanks so much, everyone. I will, if no one's got any more questions, I will spruik the next Discovering History session. Because some colleagues of mine are going to come up from La Trobe, Bundoora to deliver our next Discovering History session. This will be on the 31st of July, Thursday night at 5:30, and it's about the Sandhurst Mechanics Institute and the lives of the poets, and that's with Associate Professor Claire Knowles and Dr. Alexis Harley from La Trobe University, and they're looking using the I think my microphone might be causing problems. The Sandhurst Mechanics Institute collection, which I hope I'm not getting this wrong, is now we've got at La Trobe University Bendigo campus, right, Charles? On the second floor.
Going online.
Oh, wow, it's going online. So it's, yeah, fully, they've been digitizing away busily on the Bendigo campus. And it is still, you can still go at the La Trobe Bendigo Library if you do want to go up there. Members of the public, very welcome. You can see a lovely display on the second floor. So they'll be talking about that. So please do join us if you can, whether that's in person here or online again. Thank you so much, everybody. And we'll just thank our speakers again. Not talking about